All right, hello guys. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. I'm going to be basically summarizing chapter 4 from Sapiens, and the title of this chapter is called The Flood. But basically, I'm just going to jump right into things here with section 1, so hold on to your seats. Things are about to get pretty interesting. So anyways, to start, basically prior to the cognitive revolution, it is believed that all species of Homo sapiens, or humans as we call ourselves today, basically lived exclusively in the Afro-Asian landmass, as their technology really only allowed them to travel by foot or across very small stretches of lakes or rivers, basically via very primitive rafts. Not only were Homo sapiens limited from the large expanses of sea and oceans that separated their land masses, but the native species of plants and animals were also limited in their ability to travel and populate other land masses as well. This left distant waterlogged lands such as Australia, Hawaii, New Zealand, and others to basically evolve in isolation for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, which basically in turn meant that their ecosystems developed totally different from each other in very unique ways, rather than compared to the Afro-Asian land masses that our Homo sapien relatives would have basically become accustomed to. Due to this diversity, the planet was basically broken up into vastly different ecosystems, and it wasn't until Homo sapiens began to evolve technologically into seafaring individuals that this would begin to change. So, upon achieving and thriving within the cognitive revolution, Homo sapiens began to acquire knowledge and expertise necessary that would eventually allow them to break free from their native lands and begin a journey to far-off worlds otherwise unobtainable. It is believed that the first major achievement by these individuals was the colonialization of Australia roughly 45,000 years ago. In order for these early settlers to be able to colonize these new lands, though, they would have to basically navigate through new and treacherous water systems, some that varied even upwards to hundreds of kilometers wide. And upon eventual arrival in Australia, they would have essentially been thrown into an entirely new ecosystem and would have had to adapt overnight to this new land. It is believed that these first seafaring individuals would have begun their journey from crossing stretches of islands reaching down from what is now known as Indonesia and Malaysia, basically from southern Asia. And basically they just hopped from these different islands, continually moving southward until they eventually would have crossed a stretch of ocean to reach Australia. But basically, sadly, this can't really be confirmed because the coasts of these islands or these regions in Indonesia, over time, due to climate change and rising sea levels, the actual coastal regions are now under about 200 feet of water. And it's basically believed that the original settlements and their artifacts would have basically been lost at sea and washed away with the tide. However, though, this is basically the most plausible theory for the colonialization of Australia, as there is evidence of Homo sapiens during this time period stretching downward through these regions into Australia. So basically, more inland regions of that area have shown artifacts, and it's basically been discovered of different things moving downwards during that same time period. The moment that Homo sapiens reached Australia is revered as a pivotal moment in our human ability to reach the top of the food chain. As up until this moment in time when we reached Australia, no other mammal in existence, at least no other land mammal in existence, had ever achieved such a great feat. Not only was our ability to simply reach Australia an incredible feat and an example of our hierarchy on the food chain, but the events to come soon after also secured our position as the kings and queens of the natural world. After leaving the beaches of Australia, Homo sapiens began to leave lasting impressions on the Australian ecosystem, of which these lasting impressions are actually still notable today. When we began to move inward into Australia, we started to encounter massive alien species to us, not actual aliens, but just like foreign species, which mostly consist of marsupial creatures, including giant kangaroos that reach upwards to 2 meters in height, marsupial lions, wombats that weighed over 2.5 tons, so literally wombats basically as big as cars, and even massive snakes that could reach up to 5 meters in length and were predators as well. These animals, which once ruled supreme over Australia, were soon to meet their match, however, as within only a few thousand years after being introduced to Homo sapiens, which is really only a blip in the grand arena of evolution, they were basically almost entirely wiped out. Of the 24 species which weighed on average over 100 pounds, only one species was able to basically survive the human-induced extinction. And that basically wraps up the first section of chapter 4. All right, so now we're going to move into section 2 of chapter 4, which is titled Guilty as Charged. So, although it is bold to assume that Homo sapiens were entirely to blame for such mass levels of extinction, it is also bold to deny any wrongdoing by our distant relatives. The most common theory to deny our impact is that of naturally occurring climate change, which in a sense is true, and it would be a contributor because climate change really is a natural cyclical occurrence in the world. However, though, the extent of extinction found post-Homo sapien arrival is absolutely staggering. There's evidence of the massive marsupials mentioned prior living for quite literally millions of years before our arrival, surviving even the more extreme levels of climate change, including basically ice ages that occur roughly every 100,000 years. But even these most extreme changes in the climate, like these ice ages, were unable to basically drive these species to extinction. They just continued to live and adapt over the thousands of years. However, though, something changed in their ecosystems roughly 45,000 years ago, and quickly after, these massive animals, along with 90% of Australia's megafauna, began to die off. In addition to refuting the climate change claim, historically it's found that mass extinctions due to climate change also have a direct impact on sea creatures and fauna as well. However, there's no evidence to support or show that there were any mass extinctions underwater during the same time period, roughly 45,000 years ago, which also leads to support the impact of Homo sapiens being basically the leader of extinction on land. Another supporting claim for human forced extinction is the overwhelming evidence of colonialization of other areas around the world as well. For instance, the first settlers in New Zealand, called the Maori, arrived there roughly 800 years ago, which is more recent in human lifespan or human timelines, I guess you could say. Within only a couple hundred of years, though, since being in New Zealand, the human impact is absolutely evident, as the majority of their native megafauna quickly went extinct, along with 60% of the birds and animals that lived within it. And that's only within 200 years. A similar fate fell upon the global mammoth population, of which basically flourished for millions of years all over the northern hemisphere. This was only... They basically were pushed into the Arctic by humans as they were hunted, so they were all over the northern hemisphere, but just started getting pushed further and further north, whereas it comes into where we kind of more know them as woolly mammoths now today because they had to adapt to that ecosystem. Basically, the only surviving population of mammoths retreated to an island called Wrangel Island, which is basically found north of the coast of Siberia, so it's way up there, and that was roughly 10,000 years ago. These mammoths survived in isolation from Homo sapiens for roughly 6,000 years, and it was only until human settlers found them once again that drove their species to extinction, which is a pretty sad situation. So how did humans become such efficient bringers of destruction and extinction? If they only had Stone Age tools during this time, how could they possibly have such a large impact on the ecosystems around them? Well, this chapter basically brings a few different theories to light that support each other really quite well. The first is that the largest animals in Australia's ecosystem, or of any really new ecosystem they encountered for that matter, were typically animals that would breed very slowly. Similar to mammals or even humans, where it takes 9 months to actually grow the child in the womb, and then upon birth they would have to basically raise the child as well. This was very similar for the large animals of that time as well. So basically, due to this slow birth rate, if these animals were being hunted by humans, and they weren't producing offspring at a higher rate than they were being killed off, they were simply living on borrowed time at that point, because we had become such efficient hunters from hunting large game in Africa and Asia, that upon reaching this new land with new large animals, it was basically second nature for us to be able to hunt them. And on the other hand, these massive creatures of Australia would not have basically looked at us as being threatening creatures to them. We would have shown up and we basically would have just been naked apes, lanky creatures that, we didn't have fangs or sharp talons or anything like that. So we would have looked really unthreatening to them, and they wouldn't have been able to evolve and adapt and learn that we were a threat fast enough before we essentially were able to wipe them out. It's basically this ignorance of perception that ultimately allowed our ancestors to have an upper hand when hunting these creatures, and it really solidified our position on the top of the food chain. In addition to our hunting abilities, we would have also mastered the use of fire by the time we reached these new lands as well. So, faced with a new and threatening environment, imagine being these early settlers arriving in Australia, and you see these thick, dense forests that are filled with thorns, and who knows what type of predators are within it. What we would have done with our knowledge of fire is essentially just burn it all down. So yeah, we would have deliberately burned massive plots of land and forests as a way to not only begin to cultivate the land, but also as a means to basically hunt and scare off potential predators as well. This introduction as fire as a tool would have been something that's absolutely foreign to any domestic creatures of Australia, and would ultimately end up being their demise if they were unable to escape it. Including the idea of natural climate change occurring during this time, is also easy to point out that the ecosystems would have been very vulnerable to begin with. So during a time of climate change, an ecosystem is already going to be struggling. But once you introduce humans as the next factor, it was basically just the tipping point of throwing or pushing all these creatures into extinction. The Australian ecosystems would have been under constant threat from both natural causes and human abuse, which, due to the slow nature of evolution, they basically simply would not have been able to compete with it. And essentially, that's where we come into being guilty as charged, as being the forebringers of death and extinction for these native ecosystems, plants and animals alike. And that wraps up section 2 of chapter 4. All right, so section 3, the end of the sloth. So, human sapiens' impact in Australia is widely known as one of the first major impacts we had on the natural world. But really, it wasn't the last impact that we had. Even today, if you look at what we do with pollution and everything, we only continue the trend of humans' impact on the natural world. But basically, the next arena for ecological disaster was set to be in the Americas after, years after Australia was basically domesticated, and the European area and Russia, Asia. After that, the next stage was basically moving into the Americas. Out of all the Homo genuses, Homo sapiens were the only ones who made it here, and we did it basically roughly about 14,000 years ago. These first settlers would have had to make the trip basically by foot, traveling through Russia, basically over to Alaska. As these individuals basically made their journey through harsh terrains, they began to innovate in order to survive. So what they would have had to do was create thermal clothing out of the pelts and cloths that they would have found or cultivated from hunting. And they would have had to adapt to new ways of hunting in itself in order to basically survive in this desolate northern climate. It is believed that initially our ancestors began making the trip further and further north into the tundra, either trying to escape wars from other tribes or other Homo sapiens, but it was more likely that they were in search of big game food, as during this time period that they were starting to move further north. It's become evident through fossils and basically different artifacts left behind, that the northern tundra was basically filled with large game, such as mammoths, reindeer, and other large animals, and it's also been found that spears and other artifacts have been found in that region as well, which leads us to believe in the hunting aspect of things. So basically, being driven further and further north, these hunters would have eventually found and traveled the land bridge connecting the continents, basically connecting Russia to North America, because during this time, sea levels would have been lower, so there actually would have been a mass of land connecting the two continents. And basically, they would have been found themselves entering an entirely new world, even though they might not have known it quite yet. Once this new land was discovered and they were introduced to the new ecosystems and climates within it, their people began to migrate into the Americas in massive groups. So once they realized that they could cross this bridge and they could move to more fertile lands where there were new populations of animals and new things to hunt, they started to move over more rapidly, which basically led to them starting entirely new colonies all across North and South America. Similar to their experience in Australia, however, these individuals would encounter entirely new game to hunt and new lands to claim. They would have encountered herds of horses, mastodons and mammoths, giant lions, even rodents that today would have been the size of bears, which is pretty crazy to think about. Sadly, though, the likes of all had no match against the new intelligent and well-adapted hunters that were the Homo sapiens. Within 2,000 years of Homo sapiens reaching the Americas, most of these species would eventually go extinct. During this time period, North America lost 34 out of 47 of their large mammals, and in South America, they lost roughly 50 out of 60 of large mammals as well, which is a massive extinction if you think about that in only 2,000 years. In addition to these large species being driven to extinction, thousands of smaller animals were as well. And it's even shown that even moving into the Caribbean and in different areas like that, the same impact on the natural or native population of animals and plants basically found the same fate once they were introduced to Homo sapiens. So it's really evident that we are the real drivers, or at least the quickest driver of extinction in the natural world. And that basically wraps up section 3. All right, so section 4, the final section of this chapter, is called Noah's Ark. So it is safe to assume that one of the biggest and fastest moving ecological disasters for the animal kingdom would have been the colonialization of the New World by Homo sapiens. Time and time again, it is evident that as our ancestors traveled the world, they brought death and destruction to the native species. At the beginning of the cognitive revolution, there's estimated to have been over 200 genera of large terrestrial animals, and at the turn of the agricultural revolution, this number diminished to under 100. And that loss of over 100 species driving them to extinction is directly a result of the impact of Homo sapiens. This being said, Homo sapiens, although they were very primitive and they were basically able to do this even before the inventions of the wheel or iron tools or even writing, they were still able to use their intelligence to overcome basically the native species of these new lands. The examples of our impact of colonialization on the natural world are almost limitless, where there's evidence that even the smallest and most distant lands have eventually been contacted by humans, basically suffered the exact same fate as that of the larger land masses. The most recent tool for extinction that humans hold is not really a direct one, although in some cases it will, but basically this is through the means of pollution and land abuse. If things continue the way that they are, in the way that we're moving forward as human beings right now, it is likely that our oceans are going to be the next real arena or area for mass extinctions, which leaves whales, dolphins, and all other sea creatures essentially at our mercy. The ending of this chapter brings an interesting perspective to life, that among all of the world's large creatures, the only survivors of the human flood will be the humans themselves, and the farmyard animals that serve as galley slaves in Noah's Ark. So basically how they wrap that up is tying things to the biblical idea of Noah's Ark and saying that instead of a great flood of water, the real great flood across the world is the human population, in that the only survivor of this flood is going to be humans ourselves, and essentially the animals that we cultivate to basically serve as our slaves or as food, um, which basically leaves all other animals, if they don't fall under that class, as basically products of extinction. This was a really pretty in-depth and intense chapter, but it's a very interesting as one as well, because it brings to light essentially our impact on the natural world. And if you tie things today, you can really only see that the trend continues through human intervention and human activity across the world. Wherever we find a new land or a new area or new resources to reap, we reap it to an extent that it basically wipes out whatever is native in that region. And sadly, that trend continues today. Anyways, thank you for listening. I hope it was an interesting chapter for you guys, and hope everyone has a great day. All right.